Well, we've had a really rich set of presentations in this session, and I'd like for the audience to put on their thinking caps and come up with some questions. Make your way to the microphone. And as you do that, I'd like to have our speakers come up and put on the microphones and be ready to entertain some questions about that. Nicole, do you want to start us off?
Thanks. Wonderful, thought-provoking panel, everyone. My question is for Mark, but could be directed at all of you. Thinking about resilience. So I want to let Mark fix his microphone. Okay, thinking about resilience. So you had said modeling for sustainable and resilient food systems, and I'm curious if you could talk about the ways in which you think that modeling framework captures different dimensions of resilience and possible improvements, other dimensions that need to be included. And for the remaining panelists, how can we keep thinking about modeling resilience in a robust way across all of these different contexts?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, the use of the model that I presented there was not ideal for the resilience question, though it does deal with resilience in the sense that if you're increasing the efficiency of water use and expanding irrigation while still being efficient, you are providing additional resilience to farmers who then aren't relying just on rain-fed areas. As you increase productivity and income, farmers are more resilient because a given shock should be a smaller percentage of their income as well. We've also tried to look, in fact, recently are finishing some work with the World Bank, looking at the impact of ENSO events, the El Nino and La Nina, to look at these short-term shocks. And there we're also then exploring what are those impacts and what kinds of policy responses are available. But a lot more could be done in terms of the resilience side than what I showed you here today.
If I could jump in with a different perspective. Irrigation is incredibly important in assuring resilience, for instance, in areas which have periodic droughts. Some work that a postdoc with me has done looking just empirically at patterns of crop production in various nations around the world and what seems to be associated with more resilient systems. Higher diversity on farms does it for the local farmer, but interestingly, higher diversity in a nation, a higher diversity of crops in a nation actually also significantly stabilizes the year-to-year variation, reduces that in food production within nations. So there may be a use for diversity in agriculture as another component of resilience.
So can you give us your name and your institution?
Yeah. Mahat Tahiri, former industry. So I have a question for Mark and another one for so my question for you is for the modeling. Have you done any modeling, not for meat, but for protein? And if we had everybody in the world just following the recommendation, I know they don't listen to the recommendation, but if we had everybody in the world just eating the recommendation on protein, what would be the outcome in 2050?
We haven't done that yet. We've now got the capabilities of doing that for protein and about 15 other nutrients. That's still being finalized with a team of nutritionists and other colleagues who outside of IFPRI who are then building it in with the models. So those kinds of results should be available actually quite soon.
And my second question is, Professor Tillman, you had in your graphs you had different graphs for fish, and there was huge differences in their impact on the environment. Can you please comment on that?
So. Wild-caught fish caught on lines, long lining, where you catch them on hooks, have very low environmental impacts. But fish that are caught by trawling, basically dragging nets deep in the ocean, often on the bottom of the ocean floor, there's a lot more friction, takes a lot more diesel fuel on those ships to do it. And for the amount caught, they end up being about halfway between chicken and beef for greenhouse gas impacts. And then in fish grown in aquaculture, where there are pumps recirculating and filtering the water, they can, in many of those cases, they're up equal to beef in terms of greenhouse gas emissions because of the energy required to do that. So fish can be a low impact or a high impact depending upon how it's caught or produced.
Hi, my name is Jessica Campbell, General Mills, and I guess my question is perhaps directed to Ashkan or David, but I think it could be perhaps posed this morning as well. And I'm just trying to understand, is food safety somewhere calculated into this discussion or this topic? You know, and if so, where, knowing that food safety, there's differences in the chains across the globe, and of course that's an important thing that is delivered to our consumers through packaged food. So I'm just wondering where food safety comes into this discussion a little bit.
I can answer how we deal with this in the basically at least global burden of disease study. When it comes to the issue of food safety, generally the assumption is that the immediate acute effect rather than long-term effect. And in that sense, basically we have not incorporated in when we evaluate overall health effect. But when there are different basically opinion about that, whether we include, for example, trans fat intake as an issue of health, food safety, or other basically things that we know that they don't have acute effect. And if that's if we expand the definition of food safety, then, for example, some aspects of that we have included that.
Thank you. I'm Johanna Dwyer from the Office of Dietary Supplements at NIH, and I wondered. I think I have two questions. A specific one on the global burden of diet, I guess you'd call it. The first talk about whether dietary supplements and fortification nutrients were included in these estimates. And for all of the panel, how large are the errors of the estimates that we've been hearing, and how do you estimate those errors?
Sure. So basically, this is a great question. This is a joint project that we are currently working with the WHO to estimate all forms of malnutrition. So in global burden of disease, we have about 20 risk factors that are related to some extent to nutrition, and they cover undernutrition, which include basically stunting, wasting, and macronutrient deficiency, including zinc deficiencies and vitamin A deficiency. We have, on the other hand, diet quality or diet composition, and also we have excess calorie intake, which is overweight and obesity. And currently, one of our challenges was that basically how we could combine the effect to have a total number, how we should account for overlap, because the idea is that part of the effect of diet is through obesity, part of it is the direct effect. Now, basically, after evaluating the evidence, we have developed basically method, we have a mediation matrix to estimate that how much of the effect is basically mediated. And now we are basically combining all of those and estimating the burden of disease attributable to all forms of malnutrition. You can imagine diet alone was basically the leading risk of mortality. Undernutrition, because of they happen in the earlier life, they were the leading cause of disability-adjusted life. When we combine them, the burden is much higher. And I think this is a paper that we are planning to publish later this year. In terms of the number of estimates, I think the numbers on the macronutrient deficiency has been very unstable because of the assumptions that has been made. For example, I showed you in one of my slide, basically, if we adjust for the standard deviation of intake, taking into account daily variation, and go from usual intake to daily intake to usual intake, we see a significant difference in estimates of the deficiencies. For example, we tried that last year. We corrected the estimate of zinc deficiency for within percent variation, and the prevalence has gone down from 20 to 25% in basically populations to less than 10%. So this is another project that we are working with the UN FAO to estimate basically to reevaluate our estimates on the prevalence of undernutrition and the number of people who are affected.
Did either of the other, David or Mark, did you want to comment on variability question? Or?
Yeah, we haven't been able to figure out a way to do formal error bands given the number of variables of probability distributions in the models we have. We have done backcasting that shows solid performance other than when, for example, if you're projecting from 1970 to 2000,
you can't capture things like the collapse of the Soviet Union, which cut wheat production globally by 40 or 50%. But for substantial regions, we've been fairly accurate and have been spot on in places like China and a few others. But you're right, the error bands would be very good. It's been hard to establish those for the long-term projections.
Hello, Christy Reimers with ConAgra Brands. First, a comment for maybe the entire workshop and then a question. I think it's very important as we proceed in this conversation with lots of different people from different disciplines coming together that words matter. I'm somewhat troubled by the use of the word processed food, sometimes being used as a surrogate for high energy dense, low nutrient dense foods. And it's not easy to say high energy dense, low nutrient dense foods, so maybe we need a better surrogate for that term. But I hate for processed food, or processed foods, to be the surrogate for that, because I think that we're all reminded during tomato season, as we're processing these very high nutrient dense foods, that many processed foods, of course, are very high in nutrient density and aren't the problem. So that's just a semantics thing. My question, pardon me?
I apologize.
And no apologies needed. It's pervasive and everywhere, but I think that just by bringing up that awareness and maybe changing the words, it can perhaps help everyone communicate more effectively. My question is around meat, and specifically red meat. It's very hard to create a positive story for red meat when we talk about sustainability, yet as we know, the increase in demand for red meat continues, and we certainly find in the marketplace that if we offer a vegan or vegetarian option versus one with meat or beef, the ones with meat and beef outsell the others hands down. So that demand, we can't ignore it. How can we move forward without just saying eat less? Or maybe even, we've moved to grass-fed. Are there other solutions, whether it's technology or otherwise, that come to mind that may help be more of a solution than just, eating less?
I think it's a fundamental question that there are people who argue that our evolutionary history was as hunter-gatherers and meat was an important part of our diet, and it still has important high-density nutritional value. So I think a lot of reason we are here is that we have this conflict between our taste and response to foods that was trained by hundreds of thousands of years of our evolutionary history, and how those misdirect us in the current food environment. And the only thing I can think of, and this is just off-the-cuff comment, that might help overcome this is to put a lot more effort into having foods that are nutritionally dense and so on and lower in calories be developed that also are very high in what we perceive as taste, and it makes us want to have them. So vegan is a very new idea. I'm not a vegan, but it's a very new idea. And when I go to friends' homes who are vegans, I will admit it doesn't often taste as good as when I go to other friends' homes. And that's not because there's inherently something untasty about the foods, just that there isn't the long tradition of how they could be prepared. So I would think if some entrepreneurs or companies were to invest in really making incredibly delicious varieties of foods that were nutrient dense and so on as processed foods, that there could be a much bigger market for them than we see right now.
Just add in that vein, there is a surprisingly rapid development of the sort of clean meat or laboratory developed meat from cloned from cells that does generate in taste tests almost equal satisfaction to regular meat. That there's still a long way till it's going to be competitive meat, but it could be that here in 10 or 15 years. It's gone much faster than I expected it to. In terms of preferences, the other way, of course, is through punitive taxes. Carbon taxes hit meat far higher than the healthy foods, and direct meat taxes. But certainly in a country like the U.S., I think that's going to be a tough sell. But just remember, though, in most of Africa and much of Asia, meat's still a good thing, because if you're only eating a kilogram or two per capita, then you could have substantial increases in meat consumption there are beneficial, though, of course, not in China. But yeah, okay.
David, you may need some new vegan friends if you're not enjoying them.
Long traditions. I'm Park Wilde, And my question is a little related to the last one. I'm thinking about the interface between political science and economics and sustainable diets in the U.S., where the meat industry has almost a veto power over certain, proposals or strategies that are particularly harmful to the livelihoods that they're concerned about. And so I was thinking about how to explain some of Mark's results that at first glance, when you look at it compared to a baseline, might look fairly frightening from an industry person's perspective. And how it might actually not be so bad, and I wanted to ask you if this is the case. If the baseline actually had substantial growth in meat demand, and also if the price of meat increased due to other factors that somewhat offset the reduction due to a change in meat demand, and if the consumption, if you could sort of say again what was one really interesting slide about consumption increasing in some areas as the price fell, that would help to sort of develop a storyline that for somebody who wanted to be a good sport about sustainable diets but had some line below which they weren't willing to go, that maybe actually this conversation is still acceptable.
Yeah, in our baseline, we have about a 60% increase in meat consumption between 2015 and 2050. So by reducing it by 50% from the baseline in 2050, you still have 10% more meat consumption in 2050. So in a sense that jives with what you're saying. The prices in 2050 would be maybe 10% less than in 2015, because we do believe there's going to be higher prices, real prices in the long run. And the argument on the higher levels of consumption in developing countries, of course, is that when you take that much demand out of the global meat system, you do lower prices, and that lowers prices to poor consumers and consumers in developing countries where we didn't impose that. So it does help there as well. So essentially, it supports your argument there.
We've had a really interesting set of speeches and questions. I wanted to just close it up with one last question of my own. We've heard about data sources, data analysis, policy models. I'd like you to look into the future and look at your crystal balls and think about what all of the modeling that we've seen is done with today's tools. I'd like you to think about what new developments are likely to happen over the next few years that will affect our impression about sustainable diets, or what would you like to see happen? What do you think we need to have more of in terms of either the data collection itself, or our analysis techniques, or our policies? Just a short answer from each of you.
Well, I'll give a short answer that really mimics what Jess said. I think we know enough in broad outline. The results we've seen are large enough and the error limits around them are small enough that what we really need to do is find ways to change society such that we adopt the ideas that we're talking about, that change diets to be healthier ways and reduce the environmental impacts in the long term. So I don't think we are data limited or necessarily analysis limited, although there will be more data we can gather and more interesting analyses we can do. I think we are really policy and adoption limited, and that's where we need the greatest creativity.
Yeah, I would say, the data, in terms of the kinds of models we presented, I think David's got it pretty much right. I mean, you can get fancier. We're working with a group on machine learning to get a more integrated, bigger model. But I think in terms of what big data can do, or more precise analytical techniques can do, is on providing the highly spatially disaggregated data and real-time data that helps farmers become more efficient, use less fertilizer, use less water, and also that will, with the revolution in small scale and cheap sensors, could help revolutionize the value chains through cheaper cold storage, cheaper ways of getting food to the market. So I think it would be in those realms rather than in modeling per se that it could really do a good effect.
And I think if I just want to point one thing, that would be basically more precise data collection methods, sensor-based for individual level data we really don't know what people eat. We are making educated guess, but we don't know how far off they are.
Thank you for your, let's give our speakers a round of applause.